I'd like to welcome everyone here this morning to what we expect will be a very interesting and important discussion, and I want to welcome the Sikyong, our friend Lobsang Sangay here. It's not the first time he's been here, and it's always a pleasure to welcome him here. Before we get going with the discussion, as everyone knows, 15 days ago, our very, very dear friend Lodi Gary passed away. And he was, as we all know, a great and tireless fighter for the cause of Tibetan freedom. He was truly, not just a very dear friend, but a monumental figure in the history of the Tibetan struggle to resist Chinese oppression and to preserve Tibetan identity, culture, and religion, and the integrity of Tibetan Buddhism. From his co-founding of the Tibetan Youth Congress in 1970 to his leadership of the International Campaign for Tibet, and then, of course, to his role as the special envoy of His Holiness in 9 rounds of negotiations with Beijing to try to resolve the issue of Tibet's status and the conflict between Tibet and China. Lodi was a Tibetan leader of enormous stature and accomplishment. And of course, he was also very, very well known and respected here in the United States and in the US Congress, in policy circles, but obviously also in the administration, the various administrations that he maintained contact with, in both Democrats and Republicans, and he was a pivotal figure in institutionalizing Tibet and concern for Tibet as part of U.S. foreign policy. And that, of course, is embodied in the Tibet Policy Act, which was something he worked very hard on. Lodi was also a devoted Democrat with a small d, who helped develop the democratic institutions of the Tibetan community in exile, and who fervently emphasized and explained to me over and over again the importance of India's democracy to the cause of democracy worldwide. Lodi will actually be buried in India on Sunday in Darabam. Some people here, Ellen Bork told me this morning she's going. I know Mateo will be going, Buchang. And so that ceremony will be on Sunday. And Lodi, as I said, was a very, very dear friend and a cherished advisor to us. He'll be deeply mourned and missed. And I hope before we begin this morning's program, we'll take a moment of silence to remember Lodi and to think about everything it was that he represented and to rededicate ourselves to the cause that he gave his life to, which is the cause of Tibetan freedom. Let me now turn the program over to John Knaus, who will chair this morning's program.
Thank you, Carl. As Carl mentioned, I'm John Knaus, the Senior Director for Asia here at the National Endowment for Democracy. I'd like to welcome all of you to the endowment, and I'd like to express my thanks to the Sikyong Lobsang Sangay for making the time to speak with us today. The Sikyong will speak for about approximately 20 minutes about Tibet's experience with China's infrastructure projects and how that experience may serve as a bellwether for countries that are now taking part in China's Belt and Road Initiative. Following that, Shanthi Kalathil will offer her thoughts on the broader implications of the BRI and how it's impacting countries around the world. We will then have about 30 minutes for questions and answers after that. Before we begin, I'd ask everybody to turn off their cell phones or silence them, please, so that it doesn't distract our speakers. And with that, I will turn the podium over to Lobsang Sangay.
Good morning. Thank you, Carl, for remembering Lodi Gary. We all miss him. He made great contribution to the Tibetan cause, and he was a great Tibetan patriot. Thanks for your kind words. And thank you, John, for your kind introduction. And I brought my coffee because I just flew in from Frankfurt to DC last night. So I'm asked to give a speech on Tibetan experience of Belt and Road Initiative. Perhaps I should begin with, because we have Shanthi, a great academic. If I miss something, she will correct me. Perhaps I should start by saying I was giving a talk in South India, and two students from Africa asked me about Chinese government's investment or infrastructure-related investment in Africa. And I said, did they build good roads? They said yes. Did they build big entertainment centers? They said yes. Did they co-opt your elite or leaders? They said yes. And they said, how do you know? I said, it happened to Tibet 60 years ago, and it's happening to your country now, and it's happening around the world. Because when the Chinese army first came to Tibet, the Tibetans were singing a song. It goes like this. The Chinese Communist Party acts like a kind parent figure. It showers us with silver coins. Yatinje pama tabuyins that this is the song Tibetans sang in 1950s, praising the CCP for building a road connecting China to Tibet. By building one road connecting China to Tibet, the Chinese government said that the road will bring peace to Tibet and prosperity to Tibetans. Sounds familiar? Tibetans were paid silver coins to help build the road. The Chinese government collected silver from various parts of China, including their treasury department, and sent it to the province of Sichuan, where they purposely built factories to mint silver coins to be supplied to Tibet. However, once the road was built, the Chinese army came with trucks, tanks, and guns, and eventually invaded and occupied Tibet. This is the experience of Tibet because of the one road. The most present question today in international discourse is, what is China's Belt and Road Initiative? What is the BRI? On paper, China's BRI is defined as mega trade and infrastructure projects that aim to link about 70 countries, accounting for half the world's population and a quarter of global GDP across Asia, Europe, and Africa along ancient trade routes. Those who view the BIR as purely an infrastructure initiative have welcomed Beijing's money and expertise. In contrast, many critics, rightfully so, have expressed grave concerns that there is an alternative or ulterior motive behind China's BRI. However, what many people don't know is that one of the main keys to understanding the BRI is Tibet. Tibet is the blueprint for China's ambitious BRI project. We Tibetans lost our country because of the one road built by China, and the strategy behind use for the BRI is strikingly similar to what China used to invade and colonize Tibet. And it goes like this, the Tibetan blueprint. First, song praising the project. Second, elite grab. Third, strategic infrastructure control. Fourth, extraction of natural resources. Fifth, mass migration of Chinese people. And finally, colonization. Today, China has children from around the world singing, let me quote, "The belt connects the land, the road moves on the sea. Together, what they promise is joint prosperity." This is the song composed in praise of BRI. In another song, young leaders attending UNESCO International Youth Forum. Here I should mention that the Assistant Director General for Education at UNESCO happens to be a Chinese person. The young participants are singing, "I would like to build the road, I would like to build the world a road and furnish it with love. I would like to see the world for once, all standing hand in hand and hear the echo through the belt of peace throughout the land. Community of shared future for mankind's coming true. It's the belt and road, what the world wants today." Again, apart from the fact that the song is a rip-off of the 1970s classic Coca-Cola advertisement, "I would like to buy the world a Coke." It is startling to see history repeating itself. Decades ago, Tibetans were singing and praising China's One Road, and today the world is singing and praising the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, elite grab. After the One Road was built in Tibet, we discovered that the Chinese government had bribed members of the ruling elite. Some members, they divided into ruling loyalists and non-loyalists. And loyalists were paid in silver coins, and they became instant millionaires. And China was able to split Tibetan elites into two groups. However, once the road was built and the occupation of Tibet was completed, the Tibetan elite loyalists were of little utility to the Chinese government, so they were sent to prison. Bearing one or two, all were sent to prison after the occupation of Tibet. Xinjiang, if I'm not wrong, elite had a worse experience. They attended a meeting in Beijing, and they flew in a plane towards Xinjiang. It blew up on the way. China's elite grab strategy is at its peak today, with many of the world top leaders operating as a propaganda arm for PRC. I remember going to Australia. The media discussion was whether then Foreign Minister of Australia would meet with me or not. Of course, he did not meet with me, but I met him in the elevator when we went to the parliament. It was a karmic meeting. But next time when I went, he had left the government and has become the major consultant for the Chinese government. A trade minister of Australia who negotiated a controversial deal left the government, joined the same Chinese company as a director, and is paid $800,000 a year. And after Liu Xiaobao was given the Nobel Peace Prize, he landed in prison for a long time, and China cut off its relationship with Norway. Then Foreign Minister of Norway normalized relationship with China, and after that, His Holiness Dalai Lama, whenever he went to Norway, the Norwegian leaders would not meet with him. And then Norwegian Foreign Minister happens to be now the president of World Economic Forum. So it's not surprising that when Xi Jinping went to Davos last year, he was touted as the leader of the new world order. So from country to country, it is quite common to see former ministers and government officials providing services to the Chinese government as consultants for huge fees. Now I think the silver coins are replaced by dollars and euros. As far as China's infrastructure investment in Tibet, they have the purpose of maintaining a strategic control over the region. Xi Jinping said that the security and stability of China is dependent on security and stability of Tibet. The one road built by China is now connected to all parts of Tibet. Now one road has become 100 roads. The railway line connects Lhasa, the capital city of Tibet, to Qinghai province. Thus, both north and southeastern parts of Tibet are connected to China. Today, there are at least 30 airports and 6 military airfields in Tibet. By 2030, China plans to complete a new railway line connecting Sichuan province with Tibet, Gansu province and Yunnan province with Tibet. There is another plan to connect Xinjiang with Tibet. The railway lines in Tibet have broader implications because they will be used to connect to various parts of India and South Asia as well. So it will connect to Nepal, Sikkim, Bhutan, Arunachal Pradesh, which is next to ASEAN countries. Now, the infrastructure and economic development in Tibet has worsened the socio-economic conditions of Tibetans because of the mass influx of Han Chinese into Tibet. First, Chinese workers of the Road and Rail Initiative settled with few houses. Then they opened restaurants and shops along the road and railways. Then they built schools, hospitals, and more houses for them. Later they gained control over local businesses and become agents for Chinese companies and the government. Majority of businesses in Tibet are owned or run by Chinese. For example, in Lhasa, the capital city of Tibet, 80% or more of businesses are owned or run by Chinese. Chinese are given preferential treatment in getting licensed to open hotels, restaurants, shops, travel agencies, taxis, even rickshaws, and repair shops. And Chinese are also given incentives to marry Tibetans so that they can settle in Tibet permanently. Not just the physical control, but the construction of highways and railways has made natural resources exploitation more profitable in Tibet, as transportation of raw materials from Tibet to eastern Chinese cities much easier and cheaper. There are 132 types of minerals found in Tibet, including copper, borax, gold, uranium, and lithium. If any of you are using Chinese products, phone or iPad, you should remember that battery in your Chinese-made phones are made out of lithium, and 70% of lithium in China comes from Tibet. The Yulong copper mine in Zomda County of Chamdo is among the largest mines of its kind in the world, with an area of 1,870 square kilometers. The mine is notably the second largest mine in Asia, with a proven deposit of 6.5 million tons of copper in ore and another 10 million tons of prospective reserves. The Chengdu-Kongpo-Lhasa railway line takes an unplanned turn to connect Yulong copper mine as well, despite a long curve or detour the railway line has to take to reach the mine site. Another big mine in Tibet near Shigatse, Shetongmen mine site, will also be connected by Lhasa-Shigatse railway line. The Siling-Golmut-Lhasa railway line is connected with many natural gas deposit sites. So you can clearly see the One Belt, One Road has led to hundreds of roads, new railway lines, and new highways, all connecting to natural reserves and natural resources. After 5 simple steps, as I mentioned above, songs praising the project, elite grab, strategic infrastructure control, extraction of natural resources, and mass migration of Chinese into Tibet, China is ready to colonize you, and Tibet remains colonized now. The dangerous thing about physical infrastructure is that once the recipient country falls in the debt trap, Physical infrastructure is something China can take back. China can take control of the highways, the railways, and the transport system. And you can see examples in South Asia and other parts of the world as well. Fortunately, at the people's level at least, there is a bit of suspicion and backlash happening, which you read in Kazakhstan, you read about in Sri Lanka and Malaysia, even Pakistan and Nepal also. So a bit of a backlash is going on, and 27 out of the 28 EU countries' ambassadors in Beijing have signed a report criticizing China's BRI. So let me conclude by saying that this is the Tibetan experience. China's One Road led to the colonization of Tibet. Now, Chinese government is forcing, or politely urging, Tibetan Buddhist monks to praise Belt and Road Initiative, Tibetan leaders to praise Belt and Road Initiative. However, after the One Road tragedy in Tibet, Tibetans are saying, fool us once, shame on you. Fool us twice, shame on us. And it's time the world learn from Tibet experience and recognize the dangerous and ulterior motives behind China's ambitious BRI. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you to the Sikyong for very incisive remarks. I think there are a few regions that better exemplify some of these tactics than Tibet. So it's important to study these lessons that have been learned and to try to put them in some kind of context. What I'll try to do now is to provide some of that context briefly. And because the BRI is such a big project and it is really impossible to try to sum up all of its various aspects, I'm going to concentrate on a few of the major implications for democratic governance around the world, because this is an aspect of the Belt Road Initiative that I don't think has been sufficiently explored so far. So I'll focus on three main aspects. First, I'd like to look at what China's domestic actions and rhetoric can tell us about its intentions. Second, I'd like to look at the Belt Road Initiative's implications for democratic governance in the countries and regions where that initiative has been active. And third, take a step back and look at where we are now and maybe a path forward for democratic countries in particular to think about the Belt Road Initiative. So, what can the PRC's domestic rhetoric and actions tell us? The first is that it is now, I think, pretty obvious that China under Xi Jinping has taken a much more authoritarian turn. I think for many years, as various Chinese companies went overseas, as you saw investment in various countries, it was possible to say that engagement with China under these circumstances might help pull China into a more liberal direction. And I think as we look at what's happening with China domestically now, it is very difficult to argue that China is trending in a more liberal, open, or democratic direction. This has been fairly deliberate. If you've been following the news, you'll probably have seen that there's been any number of crackdowns recently. I think the latest came over the weekend with a number of labor rights activists rounded up all throughout China. The evidence is everywhere. And I think that what we should learn from that is that the Chinese government is not necessarily seeking to export this form of authoritarianism everywhere that it goes around the world. But inevitably, its actions overseas will reflect its values and its inherent interests. And an authoritarian regime that is comfortable behaving in a certain way within its own borders is not necessarily going to adopt radically different values when it operates overseas. I'm brought to mind of a phrase that, I think my parents might have taught me and that I've heard over the years, which is, who you are is how you behave when no one is looking. Within China's borders, if you look at the example of Xinjiang, If you look at what's happened in Tibet, as the Sikyong has just explained, if you look at what's happening even now in places like Hong Kong that were thought to be bastions of free speech and free expression and were meant to be protected from authoritarian reigning in for many years, we can see examples of how the Chinese government behaves when it thinks no one is looking. Particularly right now in Xinjiang, where there are reports of up to 1 million people in mass incarceration based solely on their ethnicity or their religion. That is done because the Chinese government feels that the eyes of the world are not upon it. And so I think one thing that we can learn is that what's happening in these places may not be possible everywhere outside of the Chinese government's borders. And it's true that the Chinese government may not have similar intentions as it does in Xinjiang or Tibet or Hong Kong or Taiwan, everywhere around the world. But its policies in these places do give an indication of its guiding principles and its intentions when no one is looking, if nothing else. I also think that the Chinese government's actions in these regions are illuminating because they indicate the degree to which communication and control of communication is an integral part of social control. And that's how the Chinese government seeks to harness communication around the world. And I'll come back to that in a minute. So, second, what are the implications for democratic governance within countries where the Chinese government, through the BRI, has invested heavily? I think there are two aspects that are relevant here. The first is that in those countries where there have been large Belt Road Initiative projects, large infrastructure projects, there's been a great deal of concern about the governance of those projects themselves, about the lack of transparency, accountability, and level playing field that accompanies these massive inflows of investment into countries, and the lack of capacity on the part of these countries to really directly address those ramifications. As the organization SIPE has put it, this kind of corrosive capital tends to exploit governance gaps around the world. And where those gaps exist and where this type of capital comes in, it can make corruption even worse. It can lead to more broadly lack of transparency and accountability and erode any type of democratic oversight that may already exist. And I would argue that this aspect of the Belt Road Initiative has received the most scrutiny so far, and that is where you're starting to see some backlash, as the Sikyong has said, to some of these investments around the world. But the second aspect of the BRI's implications for democratic governance is one that has received much less scrutiny, and that is the proactive influence and, in some cases, interference within the political landscape of the countries that the Chinese government is investing. And just as a reminder, this is not applicable only to Asia or Central Asia, which was the original focus of the Belt Road Initiative, but extends now to Latin America, to Africa, and even now through the polar regions. So essentially, almost every major region of the world has been encompassed within the Belt Road Initiative. And this extends, as the Sikyong has put it, to not simply co-opting elites and trying to sway policy decisions, but at a more deep-seated level, fundamentally altering the processes through which BRI investment and China itself can be understood. In essence, these investments in the media space, in the communication space of the target countries of investment, have succeeded in narrowing the space for discussion and in manipulating the public sphere in ways that often go unaddressed or even not understood at all. It's very hard to get at, because if there's already political influence in a space that is narrowing the space for discussion, how can you even know if that's happening? If journalists, if independent analysts are unable to truly scrutinize what is happening with BRI investment, if independent journalists trying to report on these projects are being shut down, it's very hard to get an accurate gauge of the true intrusion into the political space of the Chinese government. And I think we see examples of this throughout sub-Saharan Africa, where the Chinese government has already made considerable investments. You can see elements of this in the CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is the flagship project of the Belt Road Initiative. There's a huge media component to that, which I think is not very well understood at all. And while that has had some reporting in the domestic space, I think it is there's still much more understanding that can be built there. And finally, I think the aspect of communication that is least well understood is the digital aspect of the Belt Road Initiative, what is sometimes called the digital Silk Road. Within China, again, within Xinjiang province right now, there have been tremendous advancements made in the blending of traditional surveillance infrastructure and extremely cutting-edge forms of surveillance that employ artificial intelligence, machine learning. It's truly, it's mind-boggling to really examine what is happening there. And I think the argument is not that the Chinese government would seek to replicate this exact model everywhere that it goes, but it is surely learning lessons from this. And for governments that want to apply some aspect of this within their borders and want some Chinese government help with that, that can also be considered part of, of the Belt Road initiative in these countries. And that aspect, again, has not really been scrutinized to the extent that it might be, and that is because the space for discussing these things in some of these countries has already been narrowed. So the third aspect, where are we now and what can be done? I think we can all see now that there has been some considerable backlash, as the Sikyong has mentioned, in countries around the world where the Chinese government has been most aggressive and where there has been the most scrutiny of certain Belt and Road Initiative projects. And there has been some effort to build democratic resilience, but I would argue that that effort at resilience is under-resourced and perhaps not highly powered. And I think I would also distinguish between what we're seeing now, which is a form of backlash, which you might consider a kind of reactive element, and the proactive nurturing of democratic resilience. I think elements of backlash can actually be dangerous, particularly if we're talking about countries that may have ethnic Chinese populations who are part of those countries and have lived there for many years. I think it is incumbent upon democratic countries to ensure that they are protecting their own populations, even as they build resilience within their borders. And this goes for not simply developing countries, it goes for large Western industrialized countries as well. The proactive building of resilience is something that has to be deliberate. It means nurturing an independent media and communication space. It means ensuring that there's adequate, independent, fair coverage of these investments and of China. In many countries around the world where the Belt Road Initiative has extended, there is no domestic capacity, or very little domestic capacity, to analyze and understand China and its complexity in a fair and impartial way. And I think that capacity, again, has to be proactively nurtured. It isn't something that just happens as a matter of course. And so I think if there's a lesson to take from all of this, it's that it's not enough to simply react to the Belt Road Initiative. I think democratic countries have to proactively understand their role in illuminating aspects of it, in making sure they understand the implications fairly, and for those democratic countries that are in a position to do so, to provide an alternative, to provide something that is not simply saying this is bad, but saying these are the conditions that we're looking for: transparency, accountability, a free and open public space for discussion of all of these initiatives. And I think that, to me, would be a constructive first step for countries around the world to begin to engage in at this point. So I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you, Shanthi. And I'd like to thank both of you for fascinating presentations and for being incredibly efficient on time. You were exactly on your time limits, so thank you. So this leaves us about a half an hour for Q&A. We have a microphone, so if you have a question, please raise your hand and identify yourself when you want to speak, please.
Hi, my name is Cole Crutchfield. I'm just a postgrad student. I have two questions. My first big question is, if democratic governments get rid of the BRI, what will stop them? What will stop them from doing something similar? Because the United States did something similar back in the 50s with the Marshall Plan, with expanding economy, like giving out money to developing countries and everything else. And my second question is, would this plan last? Because China's government is limited, and it could pretty much destroy their economy eventually in the future.
So, if I understand the first question correctly, it's about the alternatives to the Belt Road?
It's like what will stop democratic governments from doing something similar if the BRI is like pretty much abolished?
I think there's a huge difference between Marshall Plan and BRI. I think we must make the distinction. As I said, Tibet experience was that the one road was supposed to bring peace in Tibet and prosperity for Tibetans, but we got colonized. With Marshall Plan, I don't think there's any country which is a colony of America now. So I think there's a huge difference. Now, whether democratic countries can, resist and have an alternative or not, it is for each country to decide. One should know what is BRI. Our experience has not been good. Hence, many other countries are saying the same thing. So that's why there is resistance, and I can give you the list of countries where they are, even in Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan. We all know about Sri Lanka and Malaysia. So that kind of resistance, that's going on. So what I'm trying to say is, be clear-eyed. We're not saying, refuse outrightly, but you should know the Tibetan experience and do what you want to do.
I mean, I think that there are initiatives to try to emphasize those aspects that the BRI does not, namely transparency, accountability, and good governance around large infrastructure projects. Those are being put forward not just by the U.S., but by the EU and by any number of other domestic national entities in different countries. Whether that's a coordinated effort or whether countries themselves try to emphasize those values, I think it's primarily at the end of the day about that, because those are the things that will benefit local populations, as opposed to the BRI approach, which does not emphasize those aspects. And I think that's the key difference.
I'll add one point too, following up on Lobsang Sangay. I think a lot of countries are rethinking their involvement with the BRI, and I think a fascinating example is Burma. Initially, the loans that were made under BRI were made to the government. And during this past summer, the Burmese government renegotiated the contracts so that they were actually with Burmese companies rather than with the Burmese government itself. So the debt is actually on the government, on the countries themselves on the companies themselves rather than the governments of those countries. And I think it could be an example for other countries that are involved in BRI as well. Are there any more questions?
Even in Nepal, there was a hydro project. As I said, elite grab or the co-optation is very important. Chinese government is very good at grabbing the ministers and the ruling elite. They don't get much involved in the democratic process of the country. So Nepali government was about to change its hand. And just before the government ended its term, they gave a major contract for 2 hydro projects to two Chinese companies. And then the now new government has come, and they have opened the contract again for bidding from around the world. The hydro project, the way the contract was given was very secretive. No one knows how it was bidded and who won. So the suspicion is obviously there was elite grab or elite co-optation not with silver coins, but with some dollars and euros. So that's what happens. So hence, each government has to be careful about who gets what in BRI and other projects.
Chris.
So Chris Walker at NED. So you've discussed the challenges that have emerged when you have, for example, elite capture or roots that are grown over a number of years to limit discussion or scrutiny of these significant projects in many settings. Most recently, there's been an example in Victoria in Australia where a very large investment deal was made in secret with the Chinese authorities as part of their investment there. This is just the latest example, and that's in an established democracy. Wondering if the speakers would talk a little bit more about what sorts of things need to happen to really deepen the resilience in these settings. I know Shanthi touched on it a little bit, but I wonder if they could explain, if you're in an environment where there's already significant elite capture and perhaps a good deal of the media space has already been circumscribed in some way, what needs to happen to respond to that in a meaningful and durable way?
Yeah, transparency, I think, personally, wherever I travel, there is a parallel Chinese delegation. They make sure that if I try to meet some members of parliament, they will enter the parliament, pressurize the members of parliament not to meet with me. And I was told, I would not name the country in Europe, the journalists had already written the article about my visit, but to get it published, one of the board of trustees of the newspaper strategized, planned it this way. He said, I will wait till midnight. When the hard paper is printed, then only your piece will go online. Otherwise, there's another trustee member who has, business interests in China who will curtail the article going public. So even in media, that much of interference is happening. So there's lack of transparency. This elite grab is going on. We all know that elite bribed and bought. And as I mentioned, some countries, this 2 countries that I mentioned. But I've been to many capitals. This year they are minister, next year they are consultant for the Chinese government. And then they do it openly, and they are called consultants. And so it's legalized, and then the agreement that they signed are quite secretive. Even the Victoria example that you gave, the government was reluctant to release the details. It took them few days or of media pressure for them to release the details. But if you look at the details, it's not that threatening, because it says everything will be decided with full consultation and consensus. But that sounds very reasonable. But if you read the 17-point agreement the Tibetans signed under duress with the Chinese government also, said the same thing. No reforms will be introduced in Tibet without consulting the Tibetan people. Obviously, there was no consultation. And the power and authority of the Dalai Lama will remain the same. That's what it said. And it never remained the same. So you might, read that agreement. It sounds very reasonable. But when it comes to implementation, when elite is already, compromised, and there's no media scrutiny, and Parliament also doesn't debate much, and then they get away with all these things.
Let me just add, the way that I conceive of democratic resilience, I think there are 2 distinct components to that. One is the governmental piece, and one is the non-governmental piece. I think there is a great deal that can be addressed by specific governmental or policy action. So, for instance, in the case of the United States, there's the Foreign Agent Registration Act, FARA, which compels public disclosure of government influence efforts within the United States. That may not be perfectly possible everywhere, but it is some effort at some kind of forced transparency. But to achieve the transparency that the Sikyong mentions, I think it can't stop simply with governmental action. I think there has to be some kind of non-governmental awareness and action to foster democratic resiliency proactively. So, Chris, to your point about the media space, it's not enough to simply say, well, we'll try to foster independent reporting. I think there has to be specific attention to these issues and a deliberate fostering of expertise on these issues. I think in many of the countries where the Belt Road Initiative is active, there's no independent expertise, and there may be a smattering of experts on these types of subjects around China, but it's something that can be deliberately fostered and brought into conversations, and that's something that I think is incumbent upon civil society to sort of examine itself. It goes for journalistic organizations, it goes for universities, it goes for think tanks, and so on, to take a proactive stance towards some of these issues.
Thank you. Hi. Kitty Thurmer, private citizen. I've just returned from a trip to Urumqi and Hotan and Turpan. And not quite related to that, what advice would you give to Africans who approached you in India? Is it too late for the inroads that the Chinese government has made into Angola, Rwanda, numerous countries in the continent? Thank you.
No, it's never too late. One should keep resisting because you don't want to be colonized. So, but it's difficult. My first trip to South Africa last February. So, Chris mentioning about media coverage, or media freedom and journalists' courage to cover on China. I was interviewed by a national radio station of South Africa. And tomorrow morning, 9 a.m., it was supposed to be broadcast. 8:45 a.m., when I gave the interview, the producer and the journalist liked it so much. The producer said they're going to use one line, every hour for next 24 hours, because I said, if South Africa can do it, so can Tibet. He said, I like that. He wants to use it every hour next day. And 9 a.m. was the broadcast. 8:45 a.m., we got a call saying, the interview is on hold because someone from top told them to put on hold, and it was never broadcast. So I was praising South Africa, and still it was not broadcast. So the media space, when it comes to China, I think is pretty limited. So now it's no more about what's happening inside Tibet. It's what is happening inside Xinjiang or in China, right here. In America also. You might have read the news about employee of Marriott Hotel who posted or shared a link of some Tibet group, and Chinese government complained. The CEO or the president of Marriott Hotel had to go to Beijing and apologize to the Chinese government in writing. I think the employee was fired, if I'm not wrong. And Mercedes-Benz employee had a quote of His Holiness Dalai Lama about compassion and kindness. The Chinese government complained, and the CEO of Beijing-based Mercedes-Benz apologized to the Chinese government. Despite all this, it's not too late. One should be aware, because the way they made us sing that song, Chinese Communist Party is like parents; they shower you with silver coins. That's what we believed actually. They were helping us build that road to connect China to Tibet, and it will bring prosperity. We believed it. We sang that song. We took all the silver coins. Now, as I said, they planned it so meticulously. They collected silver from all parts of China, including the treasury, and sent it to near Tibetan areas where they could build factories to mint silver coin, and Tibetans were paid that way. And they collected it pretty smartly. Later, all the elite, to show their loyalty to the Communist Party and Great Motherland, they started paying what they call donating silver coins in hundreds of kilograms. It's not just 10, 20 kgs that we are talking about, 20 kgs, 200 kgs, like that. So they collected right back. In the process, we lost. So what is happening in Africa also quite similar. I was there, so that there's a realization among the people's level also. So some governments have cancelled some projects because the quality was poor, the corruption was there. But like it happened in Tibet, the people who built those hydro projects, the railway or highways in Africa, also many are Chinese, were brought from China, and they settled there for a long time. So there are several China towns along the road and railways, you know. So you should be aware of all these things. Then you get a better deal.
Over here. Just a second. Wait. Could you-
According to Paul Kennedy's Rise and Fall of Great Powers, what has happened for the last 500 years is that first Portugal became global power, followed by Spain as a conquistador in South America, then United Kingdom as a British Empire, then followed by US, won the Cold War, Pax Americana. However, as everybody recognizes, China is rising. Chinese are everywhere in the world, even Africa. I was in Kenya, Nairobi, Chinese big construction on campus, University in Nairobi. Anyhow, my question is, US seems to be declining power. Western liberal democracy, what can counter this Chinese government, one-party system, how to counter United States, China behaving increasingly hegemonic power. So what the US can do about this situation? Thank you.
I think form alliances, use multilateral institutions. I know even United Nations, you know, there's a UN Human Rights Council. So there are a lot of multilateral agencies as part of United Nations or European Union, Arctic Council, so ASEAN. So if you approach bilaterally with China, you will be in trouble. Like I gave the example of Norway with Liu Xiaobo. But if you approach forming alliances with many other countries, then you can be quite effective. So that's how it should be done. But US still holds considerable influence around the world.
I would just add that I think in addition to issues like multilateral cooperation, there's a need to identify key principles that democracies stand for and uphold them, and to understand how those principles are subject to now attack and debate within international forums. So for instance, you know, this idea that, and I think this has come out in various writings, that there is an idea of human rights with Chinese characteristics. I mean, human rights are human rights. I think once you start to debate what kinds of characteristics are attached to them, that's a very slippery slope that you don't want to go down. But that approach is what China has taken within the key institutions that are defining what human rights are, that are constantly in a process of talking about what constitutes these key abiding norms for democracies. So there have been a number of reports out about how the Chinese government is seeking to fundamentally alter how nations understand human rights through mechanisms at the UN and other places. And I think at a bare minimum, democracies also need to understand not just how they can act together in a sort of a realpolitik way or a multilateral way, but also to understand the principles that they want to congregate around and defend those as well.
Carl, you had a question.
Thanks. I'd like to pick up on the Sikyong's reference to the 17-point agreement, which goes back to the very beginning of the Chinese occupation and annexation of Tibet. And maybe you could explain to us your current thinking on strategy for fighting for Tibetan rights in a context where China's policy has really always been the same. And you mentioned Liu Xiaobo, and he basically said that you can't separate the struggle for Tibetan rights from the struggle for democracy in China. the negotiations that Lodi Gary conducted with the Chinese ultimately failed because they really didn't want to, even though you can say that the current leadership in China is a little bit worse than it was under Deng Xiaoping, the Chinese have never been open to any real progress on Tibet. And is it possible to think about the struggle for Tibetan rights in the absence of trying to advance the cause for democracy in all of China?
Yes and no. If there is democracy in China, the prospect for Tibetans getting more rights and more freedom is better, for sure. But just because China becomes democracy does not necessarily mean Tibet will be democratic or Tibetans will have more rights. For example, Northern Ireland, under a democratic UK, was not necessarily the place where they had more rights. We can see Palestine and Israel as well. So democracy in one country does not necessarily guarantee. The prospect becomes better. So, as far as Tibetans are concerned, we would like to see democratic China, then our prospects will be better. But we also hold the view that the Chinese democracy activists should be aware of what Tibetans are seeking, So, definition of democracy of China should include equal rights and fundamental rights of the Tibetan people. So that way Liu Xiaobao's, Charter 08 reflects that. He does say Tibetans should be given some form of federation, and then eventually more freedom. So if that's the basis, that's acceptable.
Two hands back there.
Hi, my name is Andrew. I'm a Bowling. I'm an intern at the Center for Advanced Defense Studies. My question is primarily for Ms. Kalathil. Can you point to any models of democratic resilience in the civil society space or at the government level that you would uphold as the gold standard to be replicated elsewhere?
I don't know if we've reached a gold standard yet. There have been efforts at creating this. I think probably the most prominent effort has been in Australia, has been referenced already. That was a case where there was tremendous civil society debate around new legislation to try to prevent broadly foreign interference, although the most notable examples had come from China. I think in that case, you did see a considerable amount of engagement on the issue, which I think is healthy. It needs to be out in the open and publicly debated. And there was quite a bit of disagreement, which again, I think needs to be aired out and properly examined. The idea that you would simply rush through some of this legislation or try to put in place measures that are not right for a particular society is also not a great road to go down. So I think making sure there's adequate debate and discussion, but it needs to start with simply awareness raising and recognizing that there are issues to be addressed. I would like to point to more good examples of this, but frankly, I think that we are still in a phase of trying to figure out what those are. And we are only, I think the world generally are at a very beginning stage of that. So I don't know that we're in a place to really point to stellar examples, although again, as I say, the Australian case and perhaps in parts of Europe as well, there is increased awareness.
Yeah, I think there are many democracies. Partly the Chinese government or CCP is successful is because they take advantage of democratic processes. For example, I was in Geneva just 10 days ago, where China had to face universal periodic review, which comes every 4 years. So this year, China was scrutinized or investigated upon, whether it meets international human rights standard or not. But you can see the Chinese delegation, how they define, how they take advantage of all the processes at the UN there were only 10 countries, 13 countries which mentioned human rights and Tibet out of 140 countries. What did the Chinese government do? Now, whether it's elite grab or co-optation or not, 120 plus countries who spoke in praise of, mainly in praise of China, they also applied for time. You don't have to say anything, but they all say we want to say something, and they all came and praise after praise after praise. So we would like to believe that they were, if not paid, at least pushed to say those things. But what they did was they took time away from these 13 countries which were criticizing human rights situation in China. So each country got 45 seconds when you have 140 countries, right? Then you have to rush through whatever you have to say and mention Tibet, and we literally have to listen very carefully whether they mention Tibet or human rights or not. And same thing, European Union, even in America, the democratic system is taken advantage by the Chinese government. Right? They come here, they say all the things they want to say, do everything they want to do. You can't do the same thing in China. Now, if I could go to China and talk about Belt and Road Initiative in Beijing, then I think, it's equal footing. You don't get that. So that's why I think, the Tibetans, there's a bill in the Senate called Tibet Reciprocal Access Act, by ICT and Office of Tibet. We all are making efforts. Essentially what we are saying is Chinese officials, journalists, academic students can come to America to do whatever they want. They are welcome to do so. But American citizens should be allowed to visit Tibet as well, to study, to investigate, to cover, even for tourists. While they are denied to get visa to go to Tibet, is a reward for your behavior, not your right. For Chinese officials to come to America is their choice. That's the difference, So they take advantage of our system. I was in Europe. They all say the same thing. Why European Union cannot get their act together is because they're taking advantage of democracy. And so that's what we are, challenging against.
I think we have time for one more quick question if there's, yes, the microphone's coming.
I'm also a private citizen, but as a private citizen, it frustrates me that our news agencies do not cover these issues whatsoever on the nightly news. 1 minute, anything, to educate the American population on what is going on in these countries, what China's doing. I've seen it with my own eyes. I was in Urumqi 2 weeks ago. It was alarming. I've come home, I've told people, they go, what are you talking about? No one that I've spoken with is aware of this. Why can't we put it on the nightly news?
I just had an experience. Yesterday, I was interviewed by a German newspaper. She covers and writes about culture. She didn't know much about Asia, far less about Tibet. But she was sympathetic. She wanted to write. And she said it's been more than a year that there was an article about Tibet in the newspaper because their Beijing-based or China-based correspondent cannot go to Tibet. Right? Now, Freedom House comes with Freedom Index every year. And Tibet was listed as the least free region after Syria in 2016 and 2017. So we all know about Syria because journalists can go there. Now, how many of you know that Tibet is the second least free region in the whole world? Not many people know. Why? Because Reporters Without Borders, based in Paris, also interviewed journalists in Beijing. And what they say is, for reporters, it's more difficult to get access to Tibet than North Korea. Now, we all know about North Korea. Now, you don't know about Tibet because Chinese government refused visa or travel permits to journalists to go to Tibet. Just a week ago, there was a self-immolation. A Tibetan burned himself by the name of Dopo, a 23-year-old person. and hardly any news media cover it, because journalists, they want stories, they want interviews, they want photographs, they want videos. They don't get videos because the moment there's self-immolation, the whole internet system of that area and the phone of that area shut down. And by the time news comes out, it will be like 2 or 3 or 4 days late, and then the news media will say it's too late. Anyway, in that news media, there will be a trustee with a business in China who is also looking at making sure that the critical articles about China is not published. So that's the challenge. So that's why you have to come to NED to hear about what's going on in Tibet. So good thing you came, and do spread the word, and that's how we keep moving forward. Yeah, I think it's a difficult challenge, but nonetheless we have to fight the good fight. So I'm on my 12 cities in 26 days tour. So I have no idea where I am at what particular time, mainly because I have to, raise the Tibetan flag wherever I go, So that's the only way you change. So, but things change. I gave a talk at Freiburg in Germany, and they were asking me, they say, oh, we are so disillusioned, please give me inspiration and encouragement. And I said, my goodness, I came here to Germany with Berlin Wall, coming down on Berlin Wall as my inspiration, and I studied Max Weber as my, inspiration, and you Germans have forgotten how Berlin Wall came down, 30 years ago, and you don't know what Max Weber wrote about, right? So I took Berlin Wall as an inspiration, went to Germany, they're forgotten, so I'm constantly reminding that inspiration is right here, and we should keep, fighting the good cause and give space for truth, and things will change for the better. That's the Tibetan way of thinking, okay?
Well, I think that's a perfect note to end on. And so, unfortunately, we have run out of time. So I'd ask everybody to thank our two speakers, and we hope to see you at another event very soon.